Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, March 26th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about the 2024 election cycle and a brand new slate of Morning Consult and Bloomberg polls that reveal that a number of states, a number of key battleground states in specific, are shifting in favor of President Biden over the past couple of weeks. Now, the polls that are taken by Morning Consult and Bloomberg News are ones that are conducted roughly every single month, and so they provide a snapshot in time as to where these battleground states currently are standing in the swing state, in the dynamic between President Biden and President Trump. And in a slate again of released polls this morning, we find that in many of them you've seen a reduction in support for President Trump and an overall increase in support for President Biden relative to last month's poll and released at the end of February. Now, the shifts can be more accurately captured in by this tweet here. You can find that Wisconsin went from Trump +4 to Biden +1, Pennsylvania went from Trump +6 to a tie, Michigan went from Trump +2 to a tie, and Nevada went from Trump +6 to Trump +2 here, overall showing an increase in support for President Biden across these four key and crucial battleground states. Now, that isn't to say that President Trump did not have, his own victories. He did have them in states like Arizona and Georgia, where he's ahead by 5 and 7 points respectively. He still maintains his lead in the state of North Carolina. But what we've been emphasizing here over the past couple of weeks is that the pathway forward for President Biden to win re-election lies in the three most important states at this point, which are Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, all of which right now have Donald Trump up by a point or more, but roughly speaking are not states that are the most lopsided in favor of the GOP, and neither have they been historically. States like Georgia and North Carolina and Arizona, besides the 2020 election, and for North Carolina, besides the 2008 election, had long standed as Republican strongholds, long been states that, you hailed from as John McCain, or a state that Mitt Romney would do well in, or a state that Donald Trump won all three of them in the 2016 election. So looking at them, they aren't exactly coming into this from the same point that Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania were, states that were solidly a part of the blue wall for decades on end, narrowed up with Hillary Clinton, went over to the GOP for the first time in unison since the 1984 election, and then after that you saw some of those states go red in 1988. So a long time coming to be Republican states, but Donald Trump did exactly that. And so that was a very good thing for the GOP, a very good thing for the Trump campaign, but fundamentally, they are not the same as Georgia or Arizona or North Carolina in terms of electoral history, in terms of composition, or in terms, honestly, looking at these numbers now, of predicted outcome in the 2024 election. And so looking at these shifts here, it pretty much matches the shifts we started to see on the national level as well. Minor improvements for President Biden that show the race narrowing and tightening from what was a very large lead for President Trump in many of these states has soon turned into a state that Biden is well within reach, or in some cases leading for a state like Wisconsin, for instance. And while the averages here might show Donald Trump ahead by 4 points, 1 point, and 0.2%, it still is very, very close. Pennsylvania being the closest state of this election cycle so far. Wisconsin being the second closest, and can you guess what the third closest is? It actually is the state of Michigan at this point in time. And so Democrats are looking at this as an opportunity to reach 270 electoral votes. What Democrats realize is that they don't necessarily need all of the states that they got back in the 2020 election. When you take a look at where we are, let's see if we can move this over to the left and then lock the map here. You find is that Democrats' pathway to the presidency, doesn't rely on that many swing states. Because of the electoral math here, the Democratic Party does have a path to win the presidency with just a few states from the 2016 election that were competitive, states like Colorado and New Mexico and Virginia and Minnesota, but they don't necessarily rely on a state like Nevada, for instance. And so what would require here for Democrats to win are Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The exact number of electoral votes to give Democrats a victory, 270, meaning that Republicans would, in essence, win 268 electoral votes across the United States. I mean, you can take a look at this map as it fills up and just think about the number of swing states that Biden and Trump, would be competing in. But what actually matters here? Democrats and Republicans are going to spend tens of millions of dollars in states like Nevada and Arizona and North Carolina and Georgia and Florida and Texas. And when it matters, it helps Democrats, right? When it matters here, it could be a reason Democrats were crossing the threshold for 270. But the states at which you are seeing Democrats seeing major improvements in, states where Democrats are performing the best in, states that were, in some cases, the best for Democrats back in 2020, that lies in the Rust Belt: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. States that could dictate the next president of the United States alone. 44 out of electoral votes out of our 538 that were decided by a very narrow amount in 2020 could make all the difference in 2024. And so with these shifts in favor of President Biden, Democrats are looking to this as a sign of hope. For instance, in the last poll, again, Trump was up by 2 in Michigan, and now Biden has been at a steady increase since January, February, and now March. The state of Nevada, for instance, Donald Trump had a significantly larger lead here, from Trump +6 down to Trump +2, a reduction in Trump support and an increase, a consistent one at that, for President Biden's support. In Pennsylvania, a tie between the two candidates. What was a lead for Donald Trump of 6 points has now reduced down quite significantly to a tie between the two at 45-45. And Wisconsin here, for the first time in months, in half a year, Joe Biden leads Donald Trump in the Wisconsin new poll here, which again sort of fits the narrative of some of our recent polls here that are showing ties and one off that shows Trump ahead by 4, but the average maintaining itself with Trump up by 0.8%. And so looking at our 2024 electoral college map, it would take a small but mighty polling error for Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania to be blue states. And you know what happens if they are? Joe Biden wins re-election. Now, the Make America Great Again crowd and the Republican crowd in general have been making this argument, looking back at 2016 and 2020. For instance, snapshots from 8 years ago today said that Clinton would win Michigan by 10 and Biden would win Michigan by 4. Or in a state like Pennsylvania, that Biden and Clinton were up. Or a state like Wisconsin, where Biden was actually tied, but Clinton was up by 9, ended up losing the state of Wisconsin. And so there's two things I would have to say to that. Number one, poll quality has certainly increased since the 2016 election. They're never going to be perfect, and they're not going to be these immediate snapshots in time. A lot of the times they're taken weeks prior to what they actually release in their press release or their poll results or whatever it might be, which means, sometimes you need time leading up to an election for these polls to be super accurate. But the other point I would make is that if you look at the most recent election, the 2022 midterm elections, House election results like this and the Senate election result like this one didn't happen by chance. These aren't things that just all of a sudden happened because, Democrats were able to do, strong outreach in Pennsylvania or Arizona or Georgia and just got lucky with these results. It took a lot for the Democratic Party, but a lot was not captured by the polls we were looking at. The New York Times did a great analysis of the 2022 Senate polling averages the day, leading into the election. And so what they looked at was the fact that there were 2022 Senate polling averages that they could apply with a 2020-like polling error and a 2018-like polling error, meaning that they swing the current result of the polling by how far it was off in 2020. And the reason I look at this is because this was the same thing that, Republicans were pointing to for a reason why they believe they were going to have a landslide in their election. When you take a look at the House election results, Republicans won the national popular vote by 3 percentage points. Well, the polls said they would win by 3, but in 2020, they underestimated Trump's support by 2 to 3 points. In other elections in 2016, they underestimated Trump's support. And so Republicans were saying, if they underestimated Trump, they're underestimating Republicans now, which means the Republicans are going to win by more. But in fact, they didn't. In the Senate elections, the polls here you can actually see had Republicans up in states like North Carolina and Wisconsin and Nevada and Ohio. And, for a little bit, that ended up being true in terms of the eventual winner, but not for the case of Nevada here. But the point was, if the polls were underestimating Democrats as Republicans were building this narrative in 2016 and then in 2020, they had to have been underestimating Republicans in 2022 as well. Ohio wasn't Republican +5, it was Republican +15. Pennsylvania wasn't even, it was Republican +4. Wisconsin was going to be Republican +8, not Republican +4. It was all these arguments being made because of historical inaccuracies that, quite frankly, might have been true if they were consistent and a clear trend. But 2022 put all of that to a screeching halt. Why? Because when the actual results came through, we can go through them and see exactly how far they were off. Based on the 2020-like polling error, as many Republicans were citing was going to be similar to what happened back in 2022, and now are saying is going to happen again in 2024, states like Ohio would have been Republican +11. That simply did not happen. In North Carolina, it was narrower than 5 points. In Wisconsin, it should have been Republican +11. It ended up being Republican +1, an underestimation for Democrats. In Nevada, Republicans should have won by 3. They won by 1. Democrats won by 1. Republicans, that's a 4-point swing and a 2-point swing based on the polls. In Georgia, they said Republicans would win by 2. They lost by 2. In Pennsylvania, Republicans should have won by 3. They lost by 5. In Arizona, Republicans should have won by 1. Democrats won by 5. In New Hampshire, it should have been a tie, and Democrats won by 10. And in Colorado, Democrats should have won by 9. They won by 15. And so all across this country, the 2022 polling averages, had we, worked into this narrative, fallen, victim to this idea here that the polls only consistently underestimate Republicans, and that simply is no longer the case. It happened too in the special elections and the off-year elections we've seen in between election cycles. It happened in the Kentucky's governor race in 2023. It happened in Supreme Court elections that have taken place in between. It happened in the George Santos district on the national level. The polls said that it was going to be 4 points. It ended up being 8 points. And so forgive me when I look at numbers that show Joe Biden down by 10 points in states like North Carolina and Georgia when I say I don't believe them, because I do believe there are voters out there that are, missed out by the demographic sample, missed out by these polling firms. And while we will only be confirmed by the eventual results of the election, I genuinely do not believe today that Donald Trump would actually win Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, at least not by the margins that are predicted by the averages or were previously predicted up until this most recent shift in favor of President Biden. But I think this is also just showing a change in trajectory here. The races are getting closer and voters are paying more and more attention. The Trump versus Biden rematch that was dreaded by millions upon millions of Americans is finally coming to reality, and it's making voters pay a lot more attention. Now, I still don't believe that the polls will ever be fully accurate until after Labor Day of this year. I think the general election season, while having been started so early on, isn't really swaying voters until they start spending so much money on advertisements and digital and debate strategy and whatever it might be. Overall, you are seeing that come this November, the final 2 months leading into the election will be truly what makes all the difference. But the fact remains, the numbers are shifting in favor of President Biden, and there are very few states that refute such a notion. The only states on here that really reject that is honestly one state, and it's the state of Georgia, which saw a 1-point decrease in President Biden's support. While notable, it isn't notable enough to say that the rest of these polls are somehow in the wrong direction. Joe Biden is absolutely gaining ground, and that happens not only here, but also on the presidential. And looking at a map like this one, it might become more and more likely that this is our reality on November 5th, 2024 than any other electoral map. Because President Biden is, surprisingly enough, and I honestly believe this, in a much better position than the media or even strategists on either side of the aisle are letting on. I think right now Democrats are looking at this and are wondering, how does this happen? Well, it happens with President Biden taking on more popular policy proposals or winning over some of these states through intense campaigning and advertisement. But we know where the math is. We know where the Biden campaign's, victory comes from, and it doesn't come necessarily from Arizona and Georgia and North Carolina and Florida and Nevada and Texas. It comes in with a suburban district like Nebraska's second and the victory in the blue wall that Hillary Clinton couldn't do, but Biden could in 2020. It would take, a lot, and it would take the Democratic Party being on top of everything that they're doing in these battleground states. But fundamentally, the polls right now are shifting in favor of President Biden. It's not just the Morning Consult. It's not just CNBC. It's happening across this country, and it's happening in the states that matter the most. While some states aren't budging and President Trump's numbers are as high as they were at their highest point in the election season in some others, it's clear here that there's a pattern forming in the states that often vote in unison and often shift together. We will see, though, if this pattern, if this shift is reflected in consistency across a number of other polls, especially groups that do slates of polls in battleground states, because I genuinely am so fascinated by these numbers as we look at them, compare them to 22, compare them to 2020, compare them to 2018, compare them to 2016. There's so much to unpack and really understand more about this election cycle, but you can't ignore when shifts like this are consistent and so evident. And that's exactly what we're talking about today with these Morning Consult and Bloomberg News polls that show President Biden in a much better position than he was in a month ago. The question is, though, does this consistently stay until the November election? Chances are probably not, but again, only time will tell. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today. Sorry, tomorrow.